Hey guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Keely Ogden, I'm a writer, and I am the Vampire Girl. Today we are going to tackle a topic that I have been so freaking excited about. Today we are talking about the science behind vampires. We're going to take a look at some of the diseases that caused people to believe that vampires existed, as well as some cases of real vampires throughout history. We'll also be taking a look at things that happen to the body after death that also lended themselves to the vampire myth. As should be pretty evident, today's video is going to be dealing with blood, bodily functions, death, disease, all that good juicy stuff, literally. So if that makes you uncomfortable, feel free to sit this one out. This video may also include references or mild spoilers for these titles. In the times before modern science, when science was barely a concept or still just a little baby, people had to find their own explanations for things that were going on in their lives. The myth of vampirism ultimately resurrected itself around misconceptions about diseases and how diseases spread, what they did to the body, all that fun stuff. We've seen examples of vampire hysteria breaking out across the globe, across the centuries. There have been pockets of communities or entire countries and states that go through these vampire panic episodes. An early one we can look at took place in Hungary between 1721 and 1728. This occurred when local wildlife contracted rabies and passed it on to the human population through bite. The fact that rabies is passed through bite is not unfamiliar to those of us in the vampire community. Those who suffer with rabies also experience extreme aggression, which causes them to continue to lash out and continue biting, continue passing the disease. This is also the most common method in which vampires are created. People with rabies are also hypersensitive to things like bright lights and strong smells. This includes things like sunlight and garlic. But these aren't the only things that we can tie rabies to in the vampire world. There's also a belief that vampires have an aversion to water, whether it be holy water, running water, salt water, depends on who you ask, where you're going, and who you're talking to. This hydrophobia can also be attributed to rabies. When people suffering with rabies try to ingest water to, survive, the semi-paralysis and the spasms that are brought on by rabies cause them to choke when trying to drink water, their throat swells, they spasm, they choke, they spit it out, and they literally can't drink. Another aspect of vampire mythology that we can tie to rabies that blew my mind when I found out how is vampires' relations to mirrors and their reflections. Now, standard vampire fare is vampires have no reflections because they have no soul. Mirrors used to be backed by silver because it was a pure and holy metal. But this actually has root in some truth. As I said, people who suffer from rabies are incredibly sensitive to stimuli, and this included seeing their own reflection in mirrors. Rabies literally explains the association between vampires and their reflections. Now, of course, this would get twisted over the years into them having no reflection at all, but the fact that there's this actual tie-in between rabid people being overstimulated, seeing their own reflections, and vampires having no reflections at all was so cool to me. What? We can also tie things like the vampire's attraction to the night to rabies side effects and symptoms. Rabies attacks a part of your brain that controls your sleep center. So people with rabies also often experience insomnia, which causes them to be up all night, wander the streets, which could lead people to believe that they were wandering spirits looking through the night to, find some victim. It also attacks a part of your mind that controls your sex drive. Rabies can heighten libido to an astronomical amount, which may also tie into the myth that vampires are hypersexual and are always looking to get down and dirty in the haystacks, if you know what I mean. The carriers of rabies, who especially in this time period were mostly wolves and bats, can also explain the association between those particular animals and the vampire's ability to shapeshift. I mean, if a rabid dog bit somebody and then that somebody also contracted the same disease the dog had and died, and then his family members contracted that same disease, who wouldn't assume that that wolf or bat or any animal was actually a vampire in disguise? Another disease that had a stranglehold on the world in the 17 and 1800s was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, also known as consumption or the White Plague, killed thousands and thousands of people. It also spurred vampire panic in New England in the 1800s. Sufferers of consumption were reported to be very pale, they were constantly coughing up blood, and it just looked like something was taking the life out of them. And it was much easier to believe that it was some supernatural being that could be tracked down and killed, rather than something natural and biological that they couldn't explain or treat. The victim of tuberculosis and the victim of the vampire became almost identical, withering away, constantly having blood on their sheets, weak and unable to move. One of the most famous stories of people mistaking tuberculosis for something supernatural is the story of Mercy Brown. Mercy Brown was a 19-year-old girl living in New England who contracted consumption after it had already killed her mother and her older sister. When Mercy succumbed to the disease, they found that her brother Edwin had also contracted it. The townspeople were convinced that something was going on, especially with this family. And after weeks of attacking this girl's father, who had just lost his entire family except from his son, Mercy's father allowed the townspeople to exhume Mercy's corpse. I don't know why they focused on Mercy and not like her mother or her sister, who had both died before her. Because usually when tuberculosis attacks a city and wipes out the people, or a village, not a city, or a town, usually the first person who dies of the disease is the one who's suspected. So I'm not sure why they picked Mercy, because she was the third in the family to die. But anyway, they did. Mercy had been dead for 2 months at this point. So when the people exhumed her corpse, what they found freaked them out. Mercy was reported to look as if she had not died. She was flushed, she had blood around her mouth, her body seemed to have moved. They were convinced that Mercy was a vampire who was returning to suck the life out of her brother. The townspeople then cut out her heart, burned it, mixed it with water, and fed it to her brother as some kind of potion to hopefully break her spell on him. Of course it didn't work, and Edwin ended up dying months later. Honestly, I suspect the father of being a vampire because he was the sole survivor. That's just me, though. But the story of Mercy Brown has endured. Stories like this are not uncommon for the time period. It's so fascinating to me that we, in our modern day, can look back on these things that caused so much destruction and panic in the old world and explain them with things like bacterial infections and hereditary disorders instead of something supernatural. If you think vampire hysteria being caused by something as small as a bacteria is crazy, let me tell you about the time vampire panic was caused by corn. After people in the Americas started farming corn as one of their primary crops, corn made it across the ocean to Europe. And since it was cheaper and easier to plant, it became one of the biggest crops planted in Europe. Now, corn doesn't have a ton of nutritional value, so when people switched to eating mainly corn, their health started to deteriorate. Because you need more in your diet than just corn. The people were missing 2 incredibly important aspects of their nutrition: niacin, also known as vitamin B3, and tryptophan. These important dietary aspects are what turns the food that we intake into energy, and if we're not getting enough, our health goes by the wayside. This disease was known as pellagra. Pellagra not only causes aggression and insomnia, but it also causes what I found are known as the 3 Ds: dementia, diarrhea, and dermatitis. Now, dermatitis in this case is when your skin starts to literally deteriorate and it becomes thin and papery and scaly and awful, and it just looks like you're falling apart. People suffering from pellagra also had intense swelling in the throat and mouth, which made your lips and the inside of your mouth just look really, really red. We've gone from the highly infectious to the bacterial to the dietary. But there's one more disease that I want to talk about, and that is a hereditary condition known as porphyria. Now, porphyria isn't exclusively caused or isn't exclusively inherited. Porphyria occurs when there's too much of a compound in your blood called porphyrin. Porphyrin is an important component in the constant breakdown and circulation of your heme, or your red blood cells. Porphyria is caused by an excess amount of this porphyrin. There's an enzyme in your body that is supposed to break down porphyrin. But if you're missing that enzyme, then that porphyrin will just build and build and build, and it's bad. Like people who suffer with rabies, porphyria also causes a sensitivity to light. But direct sunlight can cause itching, rashes, and even blistering and burning to the skin. The buildup of porphyrin also shows up in your mouth and gums and makes them appear red and bloody. Porphyria also causes your gums to recede, which makes your teeth look more pronounced, almost like fangs. If the case of porphyria is extreme enough, it can even cause people to lose body parts like their ears and nose. This can give these people the appearance of some walking, half-rotted corpse. Some people believed that ingesting healthy blood would help to cure their porphyria, although there aren't many reports of people actually drinking blood to try and cure their porphyria. However, I posit that this might be where the idea of bathing in blood to remain youthful and healthy could have come from. One of the most extreme cases of this is in Countess Elizabeth Bathory. If you know me, you know Lizzie is my girl. I love Countess Bathory so much. Her story is so fascinating to me. Now, Elizabeth, due to being a noblewoman of the time, was born through a lot of inbreeding in the family. This caused her to have a lot of health issues as a child, including being prone to seizures. There's no report if she had porphyria or any other disease for that matter, but her body was all messed up. So, in hearing that drinking blood may help cure this disease or may be a remedy, it might have put in her head that blood is the source of health. Fascinating stuff. The most fascinating thing I learned while researching porphyria is the effect that garlic has on it. Now, I Am Legend is a book that we are going to be covering in the next couple of weeks to go along with this topic. It's one of my favorite books about vampires and science. One of my favorites. It's also just one of my favorite books in general. I love it so much. But the one thing that Robert Neville, the main character, could never figure out about vampires was how garlic factored into the legend. Well, Mr. Neville, let me tell you. And everybody else, I'll tell you guys too. Now, as I said, porphyria happens when there's a buildup of porphyrin and not enough red blood cells, not enough of your heme is getting broken down. Garlic actually stimulates the growth of red blood cells and their production. Excess red blood cells means excess porphyrin, which makes porphyria worse. So just ingesting garlic, but even being around garlic was enough to make sufferers of porphyria incredibly sick and even cause them pain. Who knew that garlic had such a strong impact on the human body? So we've talked about the diseases that people attribute to vampirism, but what happens when the people are already dead? As we know, vampires are supposed to be undead beings, walking corpses. When people would exhume and uncover the bodies of suspected vampires, what did they see and why is the scientific reason that they saw it? The human body is fascinating. This is not a surprise to anybody who has a human body, especially me. I've been occupying this one for quite a while and it still surprises me. Now, we gotta remember that back in the 1800s, science was still a baby. It was poking its head out there, but they didn't have the technology that we have today. And that includes in figuring out whether or not people were actually dead. Being buried alive was a very frighteningly common occurrence, especially for people who suffered with catalepsy, which is this condition that puts you into a catatonic state, your muscles seize up, and you really do look like you're dead. This caused so many people to be buried alive. It's horrific. I hate even thinking about it. If people heard moaning and groaning or pounding in graveyards, who is to say that it wasn't some kind of terrible revenant coming back from the grave to try and haunt their families? Or who's to say that poor Jerry was just taking a really good nap and somebody took him 6 feet under? Then, several days afterwards, when people would finally investigate and exhume the body, they would find scratches on the inside of the coffin, blood, fingernails, just general signs of distress from being buried alive. But they would still wonder whether the person had been buried alive or if they had come back to life. 2 famous cases of corpses apparently getting up and walking around were Peter Blagojevich and Arnold Powell. Both of these men were living in Serbia. They died both around the same time in the 1720s, and both were seen rising from the dead and walking around. Soon after these men died, other people in their villages started to die. People who were suffering after these men died reported actually seeing them being attacked by them. Hysteria or vampire fact? Well, I'm kind of leaning more towards hysteria. It's a lot easier to believe some kind of mythological monster is attacking you than to believe that you have some incurable disease brought on by something that tiny that you can't see. It's crazy. Now, in both cases, the bodies were exhumed, and both were found to be full of blood, rosy-cheeked, appeared to have moved. Their hair had continued to grow, their nails had continued to grow, their teeth had continued to grow. All the signs that pointed toward these men still being alive. So let's talk about that. Right after you die, your body goes through 4 stages. The first one is pallor mortis. And this is when all of your blood stops pumping through your body and it just leaves your flesh looking really, really pale. This then goes into livor mortis, which is where all of the blood in your body pools at the bottom. So if you die on your back, all of the blood from your body, since it's no longer pumping and no longer goes anywhere, it just kind of sinks to the bottom and just lays there. This causes the skin to look purplish and bruised because all of the blood is now concentrated in one area of the body. Next is algor mortis. Algor mortis is when your body changes to be more room temperature, so it becomes a lot colder. The final one is rigor mortis, which the true crime fans have probably heard of. Rigor mortis is when your muscles tense up and they lock and they cannot be moved, so make sure you don't die in an embarrassing pose. The more your body decomposes after death, the more these symptoms are sort of relaxed, literally, in the case of rigor mortis. So people who tended to a pale, bloodless, partially bruised, stiff as a rock corpse are not expecting to revisit that corpse later and see a normal color, blood around the mouth, and evidence of movement. After your body starts to decompose, the rigor mortis starts loosening up because your muscles are literally deteriorating. So once your muscles unlock, the arms will fall, the body will shift, and it will look like it's been up and moving around. It's not how we left it. Its arms have fallen. What's going on, Mr. Powell? Human bodies are also just giant gas machines, and I don't mean that in the way that you're taking it. Stop it. Our bodies are so full of gases and chemicals that after we die, after our body stops functioning, those gases build and build and build and make our bodies look fuller, swoller, and maybe even well-fed, as some people describe these corpses looking. The buildup of gases can also push all of that resting blood out of its way. That blood may be forced out of somebody's nose or mouth. This is why it looks like these vampires have been feeding, because all of the building up of gases has pushed that blood anywhere it can go. As your body decomposes, your flesh also begins to dehydrate and actually pull back on itself. This causes the teeth and the gums, the eyes, to look a lot more pronounced. It also causes the hair and the nails to look like they have grown, when really it's just the skin pulling back. Science! If you have made it to this point in the video, congratulations. You made it through disease and decomposition, and I'm so glad that you stuck with me through it. The next 2 months are going to be filled with science-y, vampire-y goodness, so make sure you also stick around for that. I'm also going to give you the lineup so that anybody who wants to read these books ahead of time and then watch the review, you can do it. I highly encourage it because I'm so excited. First book I'm going to be reviewing is The Strain by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan. I have read this book in the past. I'm so excited to revisit it and review it. It's so good. It's one of my favorites. Make sure to check out The Strain. Come back for my review on it later. Second one is one I already mentioned in the video, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. In my opinion, one of the best vampire books ever written. It's not very long. It's usually, I haven't been able to find a copy of it on its own. It's usually with a couple of other shorter stories. So worth the wait. Check out I Am Legend. The third, currently, is A People's History of the Vampire Uprising. I may swap it out with V-Wars. I haven't decided yet, but for right now, A People's History of the Vampire Uprising. I haven't actually read this one, so I'm excited to tackle it and let you guys know my thoughts. Then introducing us into October will be Daybreakers. Again, one of my favorite vampire movies of all time. I talked briefly about it in my top 5 vampire movies video back in, what was it, April? Wow, I've been doing this a while. If any of those titles sound interesting to you, check them out and then let's read them together. Let's like book club it. It would be fun. I hope you guys learned something today. I definitely did. Especially the mirrors and the garlic. Hello? What? That was so cool to me. I will leave some extra resources down in the description, documentaries I watched on YouTube that were just so fascinating to me. Of course, I'm a freak. I live for this stuff. It's what I do. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I love you, and I will see you all next time. Bye, guys!